Preserving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
Good morning, rural free America. This is Dan Happel and the Connecting the Dots radio program for Tuesday morning. This is October 10th, 2017, and today, I should say, my guests are Judy Boyle, a legislator from the state of Idaho, and Hank Vogler, who is a writer, rancher, and I'd call him a philosopher, who lives in eastern Nevada. And today we're going to talk about a program that we started on the Republic News Network last Thursday night, but it's a discussion of really what's going on in western rural America, the attacks on western lands, and the things that are going on in our courtrooms in Nevada and in Oregon, the trials that we've been subjected to over the last year and a half, and some of the things that are happening in our court system that tell us that there is an attack on western rural America. So, Judy, are you on the line? Would you like to do a little introduction and give our listeners a little bit of a background of your work that you've done when you were not only involved with the Idaho legislature, but also worked with Congresswoman Ellen Chenoweth Haig?
I'm sorry, Dan, Judy hasn't chimed in yet.
Oh, she has not. Okay. No. Hank, are you on?
No, I don't use drugs at all. I'm not on anything, really, except myself. But, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll introduce Hank Vogler, and I'll try to see if I can get Judy on the line. But, Hank, I gave a brief introduction of you, and what I'd like to do is start this program with you doing a discussion of how you got involved with the Hammond family, how you know them, and how that whole process came about that led to the Hammonds being imprisoned in our country.
Well, I grew up in eastern Oregon, out of Burns, quite frankly, on a privately owned ranch. My grandfather and his wife, who was an American Indian, had put a substantial ranch together after the Second World War. And they, for whatever reason, had very little trust in the government, and so they concentrated on having a private land ranch. My neighbors, many of them were hooked up with the Malheur Refuge, with the government through BLM and Forest Service permits. I had no knowledge of that. And when I got out of college, I was working for the heirs of my grandfather on what they called the Island Ranch, and befriended and became very close friends in 1971 with the Hammond family. One of the reasons was that my three daughters were about the same age as their three sons, and so I always knew when we were going to go to the Hammondses, the girls kind of got dressed up a little bit. So anyhow, and we were good friends. And one day, he part of the properties that he represented, part of the properties that I was on, suddenly found out that the government never forgives and never forgets. There's no fury like a bureaucrat scorned. And they had wanted to take over more of Harney Valley in 1908, I believe, when they set up the refuge for waterfowl. And they were not allowed to take beyond the meander line of that lake. They wanted that lake. They artificially filled it up. They quit irrigating 200 and some thousand acres. Mr. Hammond and I went to Boise, Idaho, to talk to a water lawyer, and we had several discussions. There was no precedent of law. You couldn't force somebody to use their water. So anyhow, I was trading my sheep to the Steens Mountain, right behind Mr. Hammond's properties, and we were fishing, sitting on the bank there, and I said, "Look, Dwight, the refuge has abandoned the water right. you could take a ditch and run it right across this hill and put that water in dry crumble and use it and put it to beneficial use, because this is the Great Basin. This is not interstate commerce or anything. This water doesn't run interstate. The state engineer, according to that water lawyer, is the ultimate arbiter. So what have you got to lose? Well, unfortunately, this was about 1980. He did it. It worked. The federal government had no jurisdiction over the water. He got the right to the amount of water that he diverted into dry crumble out of Davis Springs. And that day on, Mr. Hammond had a target on his back until they got him. And the fast forward, the irony was my family, my grandkids, me, we were all there at the Hammond Reservoir, and Mrs. Hammond, Susie, was sitting on the bank, and she said, and a lightning storm started. She says, "Okay, kids, 3 strikes and you're out." Everybody out of the pool, because just bang, bang, bang. Well, somehow the government didn't find those lightning strikes, but we took a picture in the house on that day. I went to Pendleton and testified for the Hammondses, and in that picture of the family, it had the time, the date, and the weather with a giant lightning strike across that. So that was very fortuitous. They were released of all the charges except domestic terrorism. When I left the next morning, I got to French Glen, where they have a fire station, BLM fire station. The chain was still across. They hadn't even opened up for business or doing anything. The weather was calm. The fire right behind the BLM station could have been put out in a few minutes. But they were going to milk it like a Holstein. That's it. That's what they call them, Holstein fires. Black trees mean green pockets. And so they weren't doing anything. I got up on top of P Hill where I had a cell phone signal, and I called Susie and I said, "You better get your cattle moved. That fire's going to go north. We got a south wind, and it's going to be terrible." They tried to save their winter feed. They tried to save everything, burned 138 acres, and are spending 5 years in jail as a domestic terrorist. Now, you go ahead and tell me that you want to sing God Bless America after hearing that. I don't.
Well, Hank, I think we still want to sing God Bless America, but we sure need to deal with the bureaucrats and the agencies and the environmental groups that are making it impossible to just pursue our rural traditional lifestyles. And I know that they think we're an enemy of the environment, but the fact is the ranchers and farmers I know are the best caretakers of the land because they depend on it for a living.
Yes, sir. If I don't take care of my range, I don't have lambs, I don't have wool, I don't have pregnancies, I don't have calves, I don't have anything. So I am the number one steward of this country. You want to see hypocrisy in action? Come to my house. I'm supposed to have 127 head of horses. There's 1,400 head of horses, and they're eating the country up. Where's the environmental groups? The hypocrisy stinks. As Mr. John Marvel from Western Watershed Project said, when they asked him about the wild horses destroying the public domain, he said, "An enemy of my enemy is my friend." So you go ahead and tell me just how much he really cares about the public land, about the public range. I mean, it is so blatantly obvious, it's beyond the pale, you know.
Right.
Look
Well,
what's
and
happening in
the fact that they'd make the statement that basically says that the rural landowners are his enemy.
Yeah.
You know, that's really it in a nutshell.
And
They want us off the land.
The wild horse people are their friends because they don't like the ranchers either, and they tell all sorts of lies that we want it all for the livestock. Well, if you took all the wild horses off tomorrow, they're not going to give me the right to any more grass than I had before, but I cannot make it for 5 years while they run it through all the swamp back in Washington, D.C., and everybody gets their pockets full of gold, and then they'll make a weak-hearted decision that won't help the horses, won't help. I mean, we're talking about father on daughter breeding. We're talking about sister on brother breeding. The known satellite studs of those bands of horses are the known sons of the father. And when he gets whipped out, it's the sickest thing you've ever witnessed in your life. And it goes on because of the swamp. You know, in the old swamp, all you can see is the top of their eyeballs. But when you drain the swamp, you get to see the rats, the snakes, the alligators, and then now we're finding out there's just as many Republicans that like to have their pockets lined with gold, that do not want to change, do not want to do anything. And I hope they all get beat either in primaries or in general elections, because nothing else, Mr. Trump has certainly exposed them for the hypocrites that they are.
Mm-hmm. No, you're right. And one thing, when you take the water out of a swamp or out of a cesspool, the only thing that's left is the slime.
You got it.
Yeah.
And it's pervasive in the whole government.
Did Judy come on the call yet? Is Judy on the line?
Yes, I am on here.
Good. Judy, glad to have you on the program. I introduced you a little bit earlier, but you were not on the line, and I want to maybe give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your background and when you worked for Congresswoman Chenoweth, and see if maybe you can give a little bit of flesh to the whole background that you have on the public lands issue.
Thank you, Dan, and I apologize for being late. I had written one number down incorrectly, so then I had to finally go back, find your email again, and try it with the correct number. But nevertheless...
Well, that's okay. We can all be off one number.
Oh, boy. Close for government work, you know. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for allowing me to be on here. And my background is I have always been involved in natural resources, ranching, agriculture, logging, mining. My grandpa just raised me to pay attention to all that kind of thing. And so it was a perfect fit when I went to work for Helen. She was a treasure to work for. We thought very much alike. I knew exactly what she expected every day and never had to check in with her on what should I do. So that was during the Clinton administration, when Babbitt's War on the West was beginning and in full swing, and it continues today, as we all know. I think the major problem we have done is we've allowed a minority of radical environmentalists to control things. You know, ranchers and rural people, we just want to be all left alone. And so we fight a battle and think it's over and go away, and the environmentalists never do. They've got a 50-year plan out there, and we just think if we fight one thing, it'll go away. And unfortunately, they have the ear of those Eastern congressmen. I learned that working for Helen. It was outrageous. At one point, I was back there, and a friend said, come out here on the Capitol steps with me and watch this. It was the Sierra Club, and they had huge posters that were about 8 feet tall of 1950 pictures of clear cuts. And their president actually stood there and said, this is what the West looks like today. They have clear cut every tree, leveled every mountain, and polluted every stream.
Wow.
I was aghast that they would lie like that. But that is what they tell Congress. They go from office to office with these kind of pictures and these kind of lies. I think they are the original fake news people.
Yeah, that's amazing. Helen was certainly a defender of the ranching and farming community, and she later married Wayne Haig, and I know that she was, well, let's put it this way, her accident and her death was one of many deaths that we've seen over the years and accidents that we've seen over the years that seem to get rid of the really good legislators, the really good Congress people, and you know, if they're not marginalized, they just kind of disappear. And it's just a shame what's happened in the West with the environmental groups. But what I'd like to do today, and I'd like you to talk about the letter that you wrote and that you circulated and had passed along to Congressman Labrador and to Attorney General Jeff Sessions about the release of the Malheur triple trial people, and maybe give a little bit of a explanation of why you circulated that letter.
Okay. That was concerning the Idaho citizens that are held in Nevada. Two of those young men, one is from Haley, the other one from Chalice, and they were at the Bundy Ranch. As you know, there are three different trials, three different tiers is what the judge calls them, of defendants down there that were in Bunkerville that the feds rounded up. So these gentlemen, that meant they weren't, tier one are the Bundys, who they consider the worst. Well, these gentlemen weren't in that tier. And they had their trial, and it was a mistrial. And it was 10-2 to acquit them on all charges. So then the judge declared a mistrial. They had another trial. That one also was a hung jury, and it was 11-1. And even at 11-1, it was unanimous to find them not guilty on 34 of the 40 charges. So those were all dismissed, and there were still these 6 charges that the one juror would not acquit them on. So we thought, okay, that's the end of it. But no, the feds came back again, and they wanted a third trial for these two gentlemen. Now, at that point, they had been in jail for nearly a year and a half. And so we thought, this is outrageous, to say the least. So another legislator, Representative Dorothy Moon, who lives over by Chalice, and she knows Scott very, very well and has known him for years, she called and said, I think we have got to do something. Let's try another letter. Now, in June, she and I and 8 other legislators had sent a letter to Sessions asking him to look at what was going on in these trials and to look at these guys who were held without bail for no reason. I mean, we're not talking about murderers. We're not talking about terrorists. We're talking about ranchers and individual citizens who went to exercise their First Amendment rights. So we sent a letter, never heard anything at all. So we tried another letter. And this time we took 36 hours, and we had 1/3 of the legislators in Idaho respond saying, put my name on the letter. Now, that's incredible for a short time frame, because it was just Dorothy and I on the phones calling people and trying to reach them. So we sent that letter off. And in it, we asked that these two gentlemen not be tried for a third time, but let loose, that another one from up in far north Idaho, Todd Engel, he was found guilty on a misdemeanor. So we asked that he be given just time served as his sentence and set free. And then we asked that Ammon Bundy is an Idaho resident, and we asked that he be allowed to have bail. He is not a flight risk. He has 6 kids and a beautiful wife, and he is not going to abandon them. So we sent that letter off. And in the meantime, other legislators heard about the letter and started calling us saying, put my name on it. So we have continued to add names. We now have over half of the entire Idaho legislature signed on to that letter, plus retired legislators. So again, we waited. We didn't hear anything. And we had also CC'd our entire delegation which are only 4 people, 2 senators, 2 congressmen, and both of the chairmen of the House and Senate Judiciary Committee. So our congressman, Raul Labrador, so he is on the first CD. He's my congressman. Dorothy's in the second. Raul read that and was aghast. So he called and said, "Have you heard anything?" "No." He said, "All right, I'll take care of it." So he wrote a personal letter to Sessions as a cover letter and with our letter, and had it hand-delivered and said, "I want to request at least a phone conversation with the Attorney General." So as soon as the AG received that, he called Raul and said, "I want to set up a phone conference immediately. I have never seen this before." So in that phone conference, he told Congressman Labrador he has not seen any letters, nothing regarding this case, and he really hadn't paid a lot of attention to it. He had gone down, sat in for a short time on one of the trials, but he didn't have all the background. And in Raul's letter, he said, "I believe there is a serious miscarriage of justice being committed." That got the AG's attention because Raul is also an attorney, and he's on the Judiciary Committee. And he and Jeff Sessions have worked together on several pieces of legislation. So the AG promised Raul that he would take a personal interest into this. And then about a week later, Scott and Eric, those are the 2 with the mistrials, their attorneys had phone calls from the federal prosecutors saying, "We want to offer you a deal." So there was a deal that Scott and Eric thought was probably all right because it was just a misdemeanor, not a felony, and they get off with time served. However, when the paperwork actually arrived, that is not what the deal was. Big surprise.
Mm-hmm. Well, it looks to be like we've got a change of attitude by Jeff Sessions, by Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and by the Trump administration. And the reason I say that is when President Trump was running for president, this Bundy and the Hammonds and all these Western lands issues, he made it a point to say that they would pay particular attention to these court hearings and stuff because they felt like there was a miscarriage of justice, and that, in fact, a lot of the Western ranchers were being unfairly targeted. I wish they'd follow up on that and actually do something about that. Do you really believe, and I know that there's a lot of Obama administration holdovers that are in the various federal agencies, but do you really believe that Jeff Sessions had no knowledge and had never received any information about these requests or really an understanding about these trials?
I absolutely do. I know how Washington works, especially when you have holdovers from a hostile administration. And I have learned that not just at the cabinet level, but also the state level. So the state BLM director, often he has no idea what really is going on down there on the ground. And when I worked for Helen, that's when I learned that if I needed something done, I went first to the district manager of the BLM and then to the state director. And then things happened. But those people that are doing things to ranchers and farmers and regular people, they don't want the head person to know that. And
right.
And most regular people, they don't know that they can go to their congressman or their state representative and ask for assistance. That's what we are there for. That's our number one job, is to stand between our citizens and government and correct wrongs.
Boy,
My grandpa taught
you
me.
were certainly an anomaly in the professional elected official ranks, because you understand that, and an awful lot of our elected leaders have no idea that that's their responsibility.
Well, I remind them of that. Often on the floor, I remind them of that. But it takes a lot of effort, and you have to know how to do it. And Idaho, we're all part-time legislators. That's what we're considered, is part-time. So we also have to have jobs to survive, and we have no staff.
Mm-hmm.
So in their defense, if you don't already know how to do this, it's kind of a, oh my gosh, what do I do? And also, people don't seem to know that that's their job, is to stand between the government and their constituents. That's their obligation.
Right. Your obligation is to represent the people, not the government. And that's why you're elected to that position. I just think that's really unique that you have that clear understanding, because I sure know an awful lot of them that don't. Hank, I wanted to bring you back into the discussion because I want to talk about these tax exemptions. I know you've worked with a lot of this stuff, and you on the ground as a rancher and as a writer for Range Magazine. But let's talk about how the tax-exempt foundations and the environmental groups have inserted their anti-ranching positions into federal policies through their political influence. They've got an enormous amount of influence. Maybe you can kind of flesh that out a little bit for our listeners.
Well, let's start back with the Great Basin National Park. It was run by the state, had 20-some employees. Then it was taken over through Harry Reid and became a national park. Now they have like 80 people working there. Nothing has grown. It's just more bureaucrats standing on more bureaucrats' shoulders. They made the exception that they could graze livestock on there because there was a history of people running livestock on it. Well, as soon as the feds got a hold of it, they started harassing the people that had the permits. Mr. Baker, you were supposed to have only 5 cows in this canyon. We saw 7. We saw 8 here, and the calls were 5 and 6 times a day. So the people that had permits in there finally said, okay, we give. Nature's Conservancy came along and bought them out. Another example is there's a guy that bought an old polygamous colony farm down out of Idaho, Nevada, and started building a monument, piling rocks, curbs and gutters, different colors of rocks, all private land. You couldn't even view it without being a participant, without putting up some money. Harry went down there, Uncle Harry Reid, everybody's idiot uncle from Nevada. We apologize to the world and the nation for him. He goes down there, looks at it. He and Obama set up a 700,000-acre view shed, they called it. The West is more for sale now than it was during the Homestead days. It just gets it gets a different connotation. It just gets a different label. So it's going to destroy a bunch of ranchers down there. Oh, they're going to let them graze, just like they did at the Lehman Cave.
Okay, Hank, hold that thought. We're going into a commercial break, but as soon as we come back out, I'd like you to finish expounding on some of those things. Welcome back to Connecting the Dots. I would like to let Hank Vogler kind of finish his thoughts on how really the various environmental groups are taking over much of the government through their political influence, and really they have an inordinate amount of money and influence over our congressional and our national leaders and our state leaders, very many of them. So, Hank, would you like to continue with the discussion that we had just before the break?
How many weeks have you got?
Well, we've got about an hour and a half, but I want to share that time with Judy, too.
Okay. here's another perfect example. Not only will eventually they make it so hard on the people in this 700,000-acre viewshed to continue to operate, hunters, backpackers, older people that are not physically capable of going to the tops of the mountains will be excluded. These are exclusive uses. There's no multiple use to this at all. Another perfect example on the other side of that coin, talking about district managers, state managers, and national managers of different agencies, Harry Reid and Las Vegas are out of water. Actually, Reno is 5 times more out of water than Las Vegas. And the new speculation in Nevada is water. Well, a few years ago, they came up with a harebrained plan to build a 300-mile pipeline to my back door and spend $15 billion exporting water to Las Vegas. Well, as crazy as that sounds, they want to do it, I believe, because it doesn't go outside. The same thing that the Hammonds and I found out about Great Basin water. There's no federal controlling authority. All you have to do is control the state engineer. 85% of the voting population is in Vegas, 10% is in Reno, Carson, and 5% is in the rural counties. So, talk about being outnumbered. So, they started on this project. They gave intergenerational wealth for ranches. There was a little divine providence, a water company and some other people that showed up and suddenly got an urge to buy the ranches just before the money train came along. But nonetheless, that's another story for another day. This pipeline will go through desert tortoise habitat where, Dan, if you and I and Judy nailed 2 boards together, we would go to jail because you can't do it without all the environmental loopholes to jump through. This pipeline will go through that. No problemo. Then it goes through other rare and endangered species where the sage grouse has been in the news. Not one environmental group said a word. Of course, all of a sudden, areas that were in wilderness study areas suddenly became wildernesses. Everything was given to the environmentalists, obviously, as a trade-off to not say anything and not drag them through the courts. It was some very tough people that took them to task. And as of right now, they're having hearings in Carson City talking about this water issue. Well, now Southern Nevada Water Authority, Las Vegas, owns a bunch of these ranches all along the pipeline, and the ones that didn't get bought got bought by friends of Harry's. So all this thing was lined up. In fact, when they reapportioned the voting districts, they added Lincoln and White Pine County into North Las Vegas to guarantee they would have the voting power in that district. And they pulled in these 2 rural counties that have no strength, but that's where the pipeline would go through. Little political pressure there. Then one of the local people right here in Ely questioned how a public utility could hold a permit. Just questioned it. He immediately got a telephone call from the state director, from the national director to who knows who. And the statement was, you will issue a permit. Well, this is a public utility. They're playing rancher, they're playing farmer, they're driving around with dyed diesel in their trucks, they got exempt plates, they don't pay any state taxes. I was on the tax commission. I helped negotiate them at least in sort of a payment in lieu of taxes that they at least would pay the property taxes that went off the rolls because it's a public utility. Yes, they did form an LLC, but you can put lipstick on a pig all day long, it's still a pig. And it's owned by a public utility, Southern Nevada Water Authority. The state engineer is not going to take their water rights away from them, so they're spending taxpayers' dollars dinging around on these ranches, and they are jackbooted thugs. They're working on every neighbor, pushing on them. Like me, I'm in the middle. I'm in their crosshairs. They are horrible to deal with. They won't deal with you. They won't do anything except call the BLM. The BLM is totally intimidated by them. All the government agencies are intimidated by them. They don't want their career to end up in Point Barrow, Alaska. It just goes on and on. This is what's going on out here in the West. And now it's going to happen all over the state. There's a place called Rye Patch Reservoir that irrigates a pretty good chunk of ground out of Lovelock. maybe not in my lifetime, but it is destined to be the water treatment plant for the Reno-Carson area, and we're going to have Reno, Carson, Las Vegas, and a giant sand dune. These aquifers have been in a negative recharge for years, and this just goes on every day. Within the BLM, there is a dozen different agendas, little groups, little cliques. Maybe they're wildlife people, maybe they're recreation people. All of these things that could be handled by the state. There's hundreds of employees. There are more people in the state of Nevada that work for the Bureau of Land Management than there are permit holders. And there's all these little secret agendas. And if you talk to them, they go, we've outlived lots of presidents. You can't get rid of them. They are there forever. But they can get rid of me in a heartbeat just by what they did to the Bundys. Destroyed their water resource, did everything to them. Who is the next Cliven Bundy? Who will be the next Wayne Hayes? 40 years they've been trying to get justice. Who will be the next Ammon Bundy? Who, innocuous, the Hammondses, they did not violate one BLM rule or regulation that they have had their permits taken away from them. They cannot turn out on the federal range. It is trashing their ranch. They're losing money. They can't run the number of livestock. They can't even use their own private land. But yet the BLM, without recording, and Susie will swear to this, they offered that they would not spend one day in jail if they would give them the land in the special use area on the Steens Mountains. So go ahead and tell me this. This is what we're looking for.
Well, and Hank, that's something that's been going on. They're depopulating the West. I mean, that's all part of the plan to really implement their so-called sustainability policies under UN Agenda 21. But they are targeting Western landowners because they feel that there's not enough of us that we can put up much opposition. And when you get someone like Cliven Bundy and Ammon Bundy who stand up against the system, one of the last men standing, truthfully, in that area, because they had run the other ranchers out of the area or bought them out. And when somebody does finally stand up, then they use the power of the courts and the power of the federal agencies and government, and basically the taxpayers are the ones footing the bill on this stuff, to destroy the private property rights of the people that want to stand up and say, no, this is my land. I paid for it, I own it, I work it, I need to be here.
Dan,
and that's exactly what's going on. I know certainly with the western lands that we have seen taken out of production because of sage grouse and all these other issues, there's no question that this policy is being implemented, and it's being implemented in a big way. Judy, tell us about some of your experiences with this. And Hank had referred to water as being the new gold of the West, and I think that's absolutely true. But I know there's a pressure now to take water out of state jurisdiction and put it into federal jurisdiction, and then eventually to put it into international jurisdiction. Have you had any experiences with that, and what are your views on that transfer of water and land and all the other areas?
Well, unfortunately, yeah, I've had some experience with that. What I wanted to say first was the only way to get rid of those embedded bureaucrats is eliminate their positions. And I think that's where the Trump administration is trying to go. It's just going to take them a while through budgets to do that, but that can be done. So back to water. I have always studied water and water law because water is gold to the West, of course. So we have fought in Idaho tooth and toenail about our water. When that huge threat came, the waters of the U.S. this last year, where the feds were going to take control of every single drop, at least the congressman did understand that threat all across America, because then it wasn't just the West, it was everywhere. So, they said, stop, we won't allow this. and the Supreme Court said the same thing. But that doesn't mean they're going to stop at all. They will never stop, these kind of people. They want absolute positive control of everything. And they really need to eliminate ranchers and farmers because we are the most independent, freedom-loving people anywhere. We haven't moved to the cities. We still know how to do things. We have common sense. We can survive. So they have to eliminate us. It's pretty much, what happened to the farmers in the Ukraine. They had to be eliminated so that the communists could control the people through food. And so many people don't understand food is national security. It's vital. But nevertheless, we had a huge fight here that went on for a long time, a very long time, over stock water rights. And two of my dear friends in Owyhee County, Tim Lowry and Paul Nettleton, we had a giant adjudication, and it was all the Snake River Basin, which is about 2/3 of Idaho, drains into the Snake River. So that adjudication, once you do a basin-wide, it opens that up so the feds can come in and claim water rights. Mm-hmm. And we battled that for years. They did not just the stock water, but they did wilderness water and Forest Service, organic rights, and it went on and on and on. But nevertheless, the stock water issue, these two brave ranchers had to fight not only the federal government for their water, but they also had to fight the state. Because the state, when this occurred, the state told all the ranchers, don't file for your stock water rights. We will take care of you. So a lot of them said, yeah, right, and so they filed anyway. And that made one particular person in our state attorney general's office very angry. And so he personally called at least these two ranchers I'm speaking of and said, don't do this. Don't proceed. We will take care of it. And they both said, yeah, right. Thank you very much. We'll take care of ourselves. So they ended up to be the only two men standing, fighting for stock water rights, and really throughout the entire West. This was a huge case that they fought in the courts for over 10 years, from 07, when we started our water rights actually was in 86, and they went before our Idaho Supreme Court against both the feds and the state, these two ranchers, and they won. It was a unanimous decision in 97. And our Supreme Court did a wonderful job. They listed everything possible from the Homestead Act on. Both of these gentlemen's water rights were 1878 and 1886. So they predated the state of Idaho, much less all these federal bureaucrat agencies. However, the legislature was not allowed to codify that decision until all these appeals and everything was finished. And finally, 3 years ago, that ended, so we could start. Well, we had the same problem with this person in the AG's office. We would have language. He would look at it and say, no, this isn't right. What he did was just delay everything so we didn't have time until session ended. Finally, last year, we said, we're doing it, whether you like it or not. So I was honored to be able to carry that legislation, and it passed unanimously in both the Senate and the House. And all it did was codify that decision from 97 that the federal agencies cannot have a water right because they don't own the livestock to put that water to beneficial use.
Right.
So then
well,
we
and
had
they don't. at least under our traditional American laws, the states own the water because, in fact, the state is within their jurisdictional boundaries, and anything within the state boundaries is state water, and therefore, it's for beneficial use of the citizens of that state. And we're seeing attacks like that in Montana. This Salish Kootenai Water Compact is a perfect example where the state will turn over the water jurisdiction to the federal government as a, let's say, a trust for the Indian tribes. Well, that completely takes it out of the state hands, and therefore it takes it out of the local citizens' hands. And that is happening all over the West, and it's one of the reasons that I think that there are an awful lot of people in this country that are finally starting to wake up because they see all these things coalescing in a way that makes an awful lot of sense if you understand that there is a war on the West.
Absolutely.
Hank, I'd like to get your input now on how radical environmentalism is big business and how they make billions through mining for foundation money. I know you've written about this in the lawsuits against government agencies, how so many of these government agencies are actually, they're insiders run by many of the people that come from these private foundations and become part of the government. So tell us what some of your experiences in exposing some of these connections between the big foundations, the big money that come through the lawsuits, and the way the federal agencies roll over to them.
And let me give you one last perspective on what's happening to grazing rights in the state of Nevada. When I was appointed to the N4 Grazing Board in about 1990, there were 46 people who had grazing permits, allotments in the Clark County, which is Las Vegas. Clive and Bundy, I believe, and one sheep guy are the last two left. 46 down to basically one because they've destroyed Clive. In the next county up, Lincoln County, there were 72. Now there's 26. And White Pine County, there used to be 143. Now there is 80. Now, yes, some of these have consolidated, but that has happened. Our take of the grazing money, which went back to the counties and the grazing board for improvements and other things, went from $186,000 a year to $32,000 a year. Now,
wow,
that's just right here in one part of the state. It's statewide, it's nationwide. We are about to be the first state to lose statehood. We're going to go back to a territory. Well, we are now because they're 87% federally owned anyhow. But I mean, it's just getting worse and worse, and more people. And one of the biggest cash cows out here is the equal access to legal justice. It was set up by Jimmy Carter for the downtrodden and the poor, I guess was the original intent, or that's what they said. So if you went up against the federal government and prevailed that because they can drag their feet, they can go to quadruple jeopardy or whatever, they can drag you through the courts for 40 years like the Haitians. You can just keep this crap up. This was supposed to, the government would then pay your attorney fees and the time you spent. Well, the environmental groups got a hold of that, and now it is a huge cash cow in the billions. And what they do is they sue the federal government if there's a T not crossed or an I not dotted, and then they charge them for all their time and troubles, and the federal judges pay them off. It's where a lot of their funding comes from. And again, it's just like Judy was talking about the clear-cut logging. I've seen the 1909 pictures of the top of the Santa Rosa Mountains in Nevada. You ought to see them today. They're beautiful, but in those days, they were probably under some real stressful situations. Nobody knew that there was an end to the feed. And it obviously needed some work done. But again, they're still showing those pictures as though that's the way it looks now. There's 6.3 billion dead trees in the federal forest. I wonder how the folks down in Napa, Sonoma, and Mendocino are getting along. all that brush and all those trees that used to be logged and created jobs, and livestock used to be grazed in those hills and mountains and around those vineyards. And it's all moved to the city. We're getting some allies, Dan, Judy. We're getting some allies from the ridiculousness that's going on, and it's starting to affect everybody. When it's my ox or your ox being gorged, it's a ho-hum, yeah, we feel your pain, see you, have a nice day. But this is getting, whether it's water or whatever issue it is, everybody in this country, the waters of the United States started to pinch everybody's feet. That's what's going on.
No, you're right. And one of the things that I'm hearing a lot about now is some of the southern states that are paying huge taxes to support all these western, things like the supplements for federal land and this sort of thing. All these eastern and southern states are starting to say, wait a minute, why are we paying all these fees and fines and all this stuff to support western lands? And one of the things that certainly has come out of the Zinke talks is that they're trying to make it look like, well, you're taking all this land that's good for everybody, and you're taking it and you're going to put it in private ownership. That's complete nonsense. We're going to take a break here, and we'll come right back, and we'll continue this discussion.
Would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution.
Well, I welcome our listeners back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and we were in a discussion with Hank Vogler on the influence of the environmental groups and how they impact through the so-called Equal Access to Justice Act, and I think that's certainly an oxymoron, but in any case, how they are impacting our federal agencies. And, Hank, I want to mention the fact, too, that our federal agencies, an awful lot of there's kind of a musical chairs relationship between these environmental groups and these federal agencies. They move back and forth in various positions within those groups, and they end up being pretty much bedfellows throughout that whole process.
Well,
so go ahead and kind of explain what you were talking about in detail, and let's go from there.
Well, Dan, it's like this. Once you get that government job, we now know that government jobs pay twice what they do in the private enterprise, plus all the benefits and everything that goes with it. Job one becomes job one. So, yeah, you keep your agenda going. And even though the state handles the wildlife, you have dozens of wildlife biologists working for the feds in different capacities. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, Park Service, all these people that basically, you just go from one agency to the other. They live on the problem. Solutions are the kryptonite to their species. They do not want solutions. They got to keep... Look, here, a perfect example. Okay, most of Kansas, Nebraska are pretty much all private land to one degree or another. They were going to try and do something with the prairie chicken. Well, we're the incubator. We're the experiment lab out here because we're so federally controlled and so sparsely populated. The governor of Kansas says, hey, you show up with that crap here, we'll throw you out of the state. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You come back again, we'll put you in jail. Miraculously, the prairie chicken didn't wind up on any list, but the sage grouse in these further western states that have a larger influence, we're still living under. We know more about the sage grouse than we ever did in history. They don't even begin to address the law as an endangered species. They don't even belong on the protected list, but yet they are still making rules and regulations. It's full employment for wildlife biologists. All of these jobs could be turned over to the state, but they're not. They're just this musical chairs, which is a very good example. They just go around and around and around. Nothing gets solved. That's kryptonite, a solution. The problem is where the money's at. It's where the retirement comes from. It's where the wages are paid. And they just keep pressuring and pressuring and pressuring. And eventually, they're going to kill the goose that lays the golden egg, and that is agriculture. You cannot live. You don't have to go to Las Vegas. You don't have to go to Disneyland. But if you don't have something to eat, it doesn't last very long.
Right, exactly. Well, the thing that it always points to is the fact that they are eliminating Western ranching and farming lifestyles so that they can depopulate the land and literally turn us back into, and this is almost I guess you'd call it the poster child of the environmental left, turn us back into pre-Columbian wilderness, which means it'll look like the land looked before the white man ever entered into the United States of America. Well, I hate to tell them this, but the fact is we've had an impact on the land, and we've learned a lot about the land, and we are so much better off environmentally than most of the underdeveloped countries in the countries that they're letting have a free pass. We are good stewards of the land, and we're getting to be better stewards of the land, but that only happens if you're making a living and you're actually somewhat prosperous. That's the only way that works. Judy, I'd like to get your discussion now on following up a little bit on this war on water and how you see so many of these federal agencies and now really international agencies entering into the battle for Western water.
Well, one thing I want to point out that it's not just the wildlife biologists that move around agency to agency. It's also those very top guys. Jim Lyons is a perfect example. He was the undersecretary of USDA under Clinton over the Forest Service. He was Mr. Spotted Owl, who designed the entire destruction of the Western timber industry. So then after Clinton, he moves to an environmental group. And then with Obama, he moves right back into the BLM. He was one of the three designers of the focal areas for sage grouse, which would completely destroy ranching in the West. And now he's moved on to another environmental group, waiting for another Enviro administration so he can go back. But nevertheless, it's very frustrating. So one example in Idaho, in Boise, there is a water company, and it used to be called United Water. And then a French company bought it. And they tried to keep that very, very quiet. They didn't want anyone to know that they owned and controlled all of the water in the city of Boise. And actually, Helen was out of office at that time, and she and I were working on a contract for Lucky Peak. This was irrigation contracts. And that company was trying to steal the irrigators' water. They were not successful at all, and BOR had to renew the irrigators' contracts. But through that, we learned that Suez was actually the owner of United Water. And they denied it publicly. They fought it. We had all the proof, so there wasn't anything they could do. And now today they're using the name Suez. But they are buying up water companies throughout America.
Well, I saw a recent article where the UN had actually told the U.S. government through BLM and the Department of the Interior that they needed to start taking much of this water that is now in private and state hands and transferring it to a common ownership, because this is the water of every citizen of the world. It can't be owned by individuals. Well, this is the collectivist crap that comes out of the UN. But the thing is that the U.S. government actually listens to some of this stuff and entertains this stuff. Obviously, if you take the water away from the people and from the states and keep moving it, passing it up further up the jurisdiction, you are going to depopulate the West, and that's pretty much exactly what their focal point is. Hank, would you talk a little bit about I guess the way you see the Patriot Act and the militarization of a lot of these federal agencies? I know we're jumping a bit on this, but see how they're actually militarizing many of the federal agencies, and it's all happened since the Patriot Act, and it's all happened because now terrorism has been redefined, and quite frankly, Western ranchers that stand up for their property rights are now being classified as terrorists.
But the folks in Ferguson, Missouri, or Baltimore, Maryland, that was okay. They were just venting their anger. I'd like to say one thing about what you mentioned prior to getting onto the Patriot Act is this pre-Columbian era.
Yeah.
Well, my grandfather traded a horse for my grandmother, so I've looked at the pre-Columbian area just a little bit. And as Grandma always said when you would ask her questions, is it don't pay to be an Indian. And I believe that's true because purest socialism of all and the poor, pitiful me argument that's always given on these Indian reservations is to oppress those people to make white people have jobs, not Indians. My sister used to be the nutritionist for the state of Nevada for the Indian tribes. She took me to one of her parties, and everybody there had Lexuses and BMWs and nice houses, nice clothes, nice cars. And I said, look at this, Bonnie. You and I are the only two people here that are even Indians. And all these people are living off of keeping one or two Indians alive on these reservations by telling them poor, pitiful me. Grandma was right. It don't pay to be an Indian. So anyhow, Patriot Act. Yes, I had an example of that. Because I have been an outspoken person, and I first of all qualify every Bureau of Land Management office I've been in, there are capable people in there. They're dedicated to getting things done, and they can. Everybody with all their agendas, it's a mess. But I was embroiled, practically baptized in fire when I got here. And started to have a BLM officer. And somebody in that office said that I was some sort of an outlaw. He used to drive by 3 or 4 times a day. He used to try and figure out why my sheep camps didn't have license plates on them. We had old water trucks that never went on the highway. He just started harassing us. He stood above my house all one night in a snowstorm. I don't know what he was doing, listening to me snore. I have no idea. All of these things. They get their own agenda. Then they have to justify their own job. So they start looking for boogeymen. It's nothing more than harassment. We have a sheriff's department, local. Thomas Jefferson, the government closest to the people works the best. That's a paraphrase, but that's what he said. Same thing. But so they're going out, they're making boogeymen where they do not exist. So, and they've done it at the Forest Service. One of the guys, and they transferred him, showed up at the Forest Service. I mean, he had more armament than the 1st Infantry Division. I mean, unbelievable. And going around and just harassing people right and left, and they finally got him out of here. Mr. Love, he thought he should be Cadillac'd at the Burning Man outfit. So they fired him finally. But he was the instigator down there against the Bundy. So they have to commit horrific acts of stupidity before you can even get rid of them. And then, as Judy said, they warehouse them for a couple of years, and give them a fresh coat of paint, and they bring them back in some other agency or some other government. It's, if 2 things need to be done that will help America, and the good news is communism, socialism is starting to get in the newspaper just like The Vietnam War got into the newspapers every day. Everywhere it's tried, whether it's Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, China, wherever socialism is tried, it failed. We got to get a hold of the Department of Education. The kids are all being told bald-faced lies about the history of America. We've got to do that. If we can do that, and if we can limit the number of people that are just vegetating, trying to figure out how to keep their job going in the government, we've got to eliminate that. We don't have a taxing problem. We have a spending problem, and that's as good a place as any to start.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. The federal agencies, and incidentally, you and I talked about this. You were on a BLM RAC, Resource Advisory Council, down in Nevada. I was also on one in western Montana, and we were talking about the sage-grouse. This was something when they were talking about listing the sage-grouse as an endangered species. Well, you know, the proof was on. Predators were the reason that the sage-grouse were being reduced. The number of coyotes and well, all the predatory birds, the ravens, the eagles, and the ravens, obviously, they're nest robbers, but there's so many of these things that were attacking the sage-grouse that the predators were by far and away the biggest part of this problem with the reduction in sage-grouse population. When in the 1940s and 50s, when the sheep and the cattle ranchers had the largest influence on the land, had the most in production, at that point in time, the sage-grouse numbers were the highest, and it was because we were limiting the amount of predators on the land. Well, when I brought that up to the BLM RAC and said, we're focusing on the wrong things, they came back to me and they said, no, our mandate is that we are supposed to only look at the impact that man has on the footprint of the land. So in other words, it was a stacked deck. There was a predetermined conclusion, and it was supposed to be that we've got to get rid of man, we've got to get rid of ranching and farming, and we've got to get rid of natural resource production on the land. That's the sort of thing that's been really been used as an attack on the West. And Hank, I know you've had very similar situations where you're at.
Well, when I was in grade school and high school in the 50s and the 60s, sage-grouse, you were allowed to shoot 6 a day. You could have 12 in possession. The season was 30 days long. And when you jump a bunch of them up, a lot of times they'd blacken the sky. There were so many of them. But there were no predators. All the baseline data on predator control, goes back to a period in time when we had effective methods of limiting predators. So the prey base was huge, whether it be mule deer or sage-grouse. They were everywhere. Where I grew up, if you shot anything less than a 4-point, you were considered a Portland doe hunter. There were trophies everywhere. There was all kinds of things going on. And so the data that they started with was so out of whack, so lacking in common sense, you can chart the day that they passed all of these rules and regulations under Richard Nixon. And, of course, Congress and the Senate was controlled by the Democrats. As the number of livestock and livestock protection went down, the predator base went up. The deer herds used to bring in billions of dollars to the rural communities. Motels were rented years in advance, and you didn't have to draw for a tag. They were available over the counter any day. All these things went in the tank. Millions and millions of dollars went out of the rural areas. Now, all of a sudden, the biggest growth business in the West is fire. And people are going to get tired of this because they've bought these cabin sites and these summer homes right in the forest that used to be parts of old ranches that they've broke up because they could no longer economically feasible stay in the ranches. So they're right in the timber. And, of course, they want au naturel, so they don't cut those trees and make houses and piano benches out of them. They just let them burn. Well, it's gotten out of control. There is our ally. is other people, just like the people in Kansas would not put up with that prairie chicken going on that endangered species list, and like magic, it didn't wind up there. But in the West, where they're depopulated, you know, Burns, Oregon used to have 1,000 guys working that lumber mill, and about 4,000 people supported it. There was sustained yield logging. I know that sustainability is a bad word today, but they planted more trees than they cut down. They managed those forests. They manicured them. They thinned those trees out. They took the porky top trees. There was a huge fire, would be 1,000 acres. I mean, it was unbelievable how well kept it was. The livestock, everything. Now, guess what? Fire may be our ally that people, like what's going on in California, the West has 6.3 billion with a B dead trees. And if that's an estimate, I bet it's closer to a half a trillion. Whatever. Yeah. But all these things, those are going to be our allies. People have had a gut full of government. That's why we voted for Donald Trump. I'd have choked down Jeb Bush if I'd have had to. But I voted for Donald Trump because I'd had a gut full of the Clintons and the Obamas. The only thing you could say, the only guy that's happy about the Obama administration is Jimmy Carter. He's no longer the worst president we've ever had in the last 100 years.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. Well, Judy, this is a great segue into a subject near and dear to you, and that is the reintroduction of wolves in Idaho. Montana, Idaho, all of the Northwest now are suffering from predation by wolves, and they literally are out of control, whether the wildlife biologists admit it or not. They are throughout the West, and they are a real problem for rural landowners, farmers, ranchers. Anybody that has livestock has a concern about the wolves in the West. So tell us about some of the things that are going on in Idaho and your perspective on the reintroduction of wolves.
Well, brought to us by Bruce Babbitt again. He knew exactly what he was doing. When the biologists went to Canada to pick up those Canadian wolves, the biologists up there said, "Do you guys really know what you are turning loose down there? You sure you want to do this?" And Babbitt was sure that's what he wanted. So we have been battling that since '95. Wolves spread very quickly. The only way we could delist was all 3 states had to meet a very, very strict standard for numbers, and 2 of us could meet it, 1 of us couldn't, and then 1 of us could and 2 of us couldn't. It was just such an outrageous thing. So anyway, we've been battling that, lost tons and tons of livestock, but our allies are the hunters, because they are seeing the huge effect that wolves have had on wildlife. I was in Salmon a couple weeks ago, and there was an outfitter at our meeting. So there were about 40 ranches represented there. And this outfitter said he'd been in business 39 years. He only took 18 people with him always. That was his number. And he said, we never had trouble limiting out until about 2000, and it started getting bad. 2012, it went down in nosedives. This year, his 18 hunters, himself and his guides, never even saw an elk at all. Mm-hmm. So this is outside of Salmon, and why we had the meeting was the ranchers were saying, we have got to do something about elk predation. One rancher said he's got 600 elk on his private land 12 months out of the year. Can you imagine what damage that does? Oh, yeah. And our Fish and Game, I was so appalled. They actually stood there and they said, we are going to take care of this. We'll have a depredation hunt. It'll start the 1st of January and end the 28th of February. And that will teach the elk to go back to the mountains where they're supposed to be. Then it was my turn to talk, and I said, you know, it's going to be a little hard to teach the elk to go to the mountains so they can be eaten by wolves. there's just no common sense at all.
Yeah, there isn't, and you're exactly right. That's exactly the mindset of these people. But think about it this way, Judy. If you want to get rid of ranching, what's a good way to do it? You introduce these predators and then force the wild game down on their land where they can't make a living off their land anymore.
Exactly. And, the wolves, of course, have come down. They started immediately. It was, I think, a week after they were released that they killed the first calf over there by Chalice, between Chalice and Salmon, which caused a huge uproar. U.S. Fish and Wildlife law enforcement came to arrest the rancher, who was a World War II vet and gave up his guns and hunting totally when he came back from the war. And they came to arrest him because they knew he was the one that shot the wolf. And they were so intent on lying about this. The vet over there came because he, got one of the first calls, and so he did an autopsy on the calf. His autopsy, which was videoed, by the way, by his wife, and the wildlife trapper, U.S. Fish and Wildlife trapper was there. Not U.S., I'm sorry. USDA trapper of Wildlife Services was there to watch the autopsy. And he said clearly this calf was born alive. It has colostrum in its stomach and mud between its toes. And right now I can't remember which sex it was, but let's say he said this was a heifer. Well, U.S. Fish and Wildlife came, swooped it up, took it to Ashland, Oregon, to their lab, and they came back that obviously this was a stillborn calf that the wolf was eating, and it was the opposite sex of what is on the video.
Wow.
They were so intent on lying and going after this poor rancher who lived by himself way up in the boondocks. The sheriff was actually protecting this rancher from those federal agents. It was such an incredible uproar, but that has set the tone of where we are with wolves and the enviros in the federal government and the state government. They are determined they're going to just push those wolves. They want them to keep growing. They've been delisted twice. The last time they were delisted, it literally took an act of Congress to say these animals are delisted, period, with no judicial review. That's the only way we got them permanently delisted.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dave Foreman, who was the founder of Earth First, along with a Florida professor, and I can't remember his name right now, I'll have to look that up at some point, were the ones that came up with originally the idea of reintroducing all these large predators because they said it was absolutely essential because of the changes that humans had made in the planet, that the reintroduction of large predators was the only way that we'd be able to save the environment. And this is insane, absolutely insane. When we come back, we'll get more information on this from Hank and Judy, and then we'll be talking about a new show that's going to be coming on tomorrow at 9 a.m. Thank you. Well, welcome back to our listeners. I have to tell people about an exciting new program that's going to be coming up tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Debbie Boscalupi is going to be hosting a 2-hour program once a week that will be starting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And Debbie has been probably one of the premier and most outspoken anti-Agenda 21 presenters in the entire country, and some of the information on UN Agenda 21, she's been at a lot of the conferences, and she knows firsthand about a lot of the stuff that's happening in our country, the attacks on the West and why they are there. She's from a Northern California ranching family, Southern Oregon area, Northern California, and she understands how these things are happening, and she will be giving a terrific program. I'm really looking forward to listening to her show. Probably we'll be working together a lot because she understands much of the same stuff that I understand, that Hank understands, that Judy understands. We're all trying to protect the citizens of the western United States against the attacks against private property. And that's something that we really need to try to expose and understand how that's happening. So we've talked about the fact that there are attacks on grazing rights. We've talked about the fact that there are attacks on water rights. We've talked about the attacks on private property. And we've talked about the reintroduction of large predators into the environment. We've also talked about how many of the environmental groups are literally taking over the federal agencies. So that gets us back to the topic that we started this discussion with, and that is the Malheur and the Bundy court hearings and what's been going on in Oregon and Nevada. And so I'd like to get back on that subject with Hank and Judy because they're both very intimately aware of all the circumstances and the things that have been happening with those various trials. And so with that, I'd like, Hank, would you like to lead into your understanding of why the court systems are being so abused against the private citizens of the West?
Well, you just have to look at who appointed the lady in Las Vegas that's doing her down there. The judge said it shocks the conscience to call the Hammonds eco-terrorists, domestic terrorists, or whatever it was, and gave them a life sentence. It was the Bureau that came back with a vengeance. They couldn't handle that. They are the only ones that can be right. And so then the next time it went to a judge, in Eugene, Oregon, which is I used to tell my kids I had to help them go to college anywhere they wanted except the University of Oregon or Reed College in Portland. I never saw a kid from Eastern Oregon that went to school at that time. When I was growing up, went to the University of Oregon that came back in the same vein. They just were taught to march to a very strange drum. So they get this judge there that convicts him, and then it can't even get him convicted. Then it goes to the Ninth Circuit Court. All this kind of stuff. The Hammonds are Aussie inherit. They're June and Ward Cleaver. The real swashbuckler is Susie. Been to many meetings with her over the years. She walks in. She has her facts and figures, the Constitution, the rules, the regulations, the Taylor Grazing Act. And about a third way through the meeting, she starts to put the facts on the table, and the bureaucrats all get up and leave. That's their problem. Dwight basically was a truck driver. The kids and Susie ran the ranch, and for walking around money, Dwight drove a cattle truck all the time. They were a family that worked their fingers to the bone to keep together the American dream of the private ownership of land, etc., etc. No greater example than there was, but they made one terrible mistake. I was listening to me about getting some water away from the feds. And it was downhill from there. And it's ridiculous. Now they're still being persecuted. They've got private land. They own most of the water on their allotments, but the rest of the land, control the water, control the land, they can't use any of it without a burdensome expense of trying to fence it out. Plus, then they lose the AUMs that they had available on the BLM. They violated no BLM laws. This was domestic terrorism. And for however many years, I was going through pancreatic cancer when this was all going on, and by the time I left the trial in Pendleton, Oregon, I could no longer walk, and wound up in the Huntsman Cancer Center in Utah. So that was 2011, 2012, June of 2012, I believe. For all these years, they've never had their BLM permits reinstated. Never. And it's just ridiculous. We're in mitigation right now. I'm part of the group, Hammond Ranches Incorporated, trying to get their permits reinstated. And it's just one bureaucrat sticking up for another bureaucrat, sticking up for another bureaucrat. It would make anybody cringe if it was happening to them. It just is not right. It is crazy.
Well, I have to tell you about Jeanette Fennicum, because Jeanette Fennicum, after they killed Lavoie, and that was obvious, to me it was a ambush, but after Lavoie was killed, Jeanette naturally took over the ranch, and all of the BLM leases that were, grazing leases for the Fennicum Ranch, then would typically revert to Jeanette. Well, she's been in court ever since his death trying to get ownership and title to the rights to the public land grazing as well as her own ranch. And the federal agencies are just dragging their feet. They won't do any of it, and they figure that they can outlast her. So she can't graze cattle on the land that they had under grazing lease, and so she's having to take her cattle over to her sister-in-law's place and put her cattle on their place because there's no access to the grass on their own land. And this is the sort of thing that just blows your mind that they can get away with this kind of nonsense, that the federal agencies can drag this stuff out and make everybody eventually just go away because they have no right to their own land. Judy,
do you know that they
tell us what your background on the Bundy trials and the information there. I know you got deeply involved because of the two gentlemen that were actually three, that were Idaho citizens with Ammon Bundy. But tell us some of the other experiences that you've had and why you see this huge miscarriage of justice.
Well, I actually got to meet Dwight and Susie in about 92 with Helen. Helen had known them previous to that, and it's just such a horrendous thing what they have just constantly been harassed by our own government. And then one of my former 4-H kids actually worked for Dwight and Susie in the summer for college money while she went to college. So I know they are wonderful, wonderful people who just want to be left alone to raise their kids and ranch. And what happened to them is probably the worst tragedy that ever could be. There was no reason in the world to charge them under that act that they were charged with. That act was passed because of Oklahoma City. That was about real domestic terrorism, not simply burning some sagebrush and junipers defending your ranch. Terrible. And I would hope that we can appeal across America to President Trump to pardon those poor people, those two men that did not ever deserve to go through this. So with that background, when all this happened over there, I'm like, wow, this is outrageous. I wasn't able to go when they did the protest march for Dwight and Susie before the feds came to haul Steve and Dwight off. But then I watched, Ammon and all those guys go to the refuge, and I thought, oh, this doesn't look like a good place to fight. Look what they did at Ruby Ridge. Look what they did at Waco. These guys are setting ducks for disaster under a bad administration, a bad county commission, and a bad sheriff. That is not the high ground to make a stand on. So I had a call from some legislators in other states saying, we're going to go over there, would you go with us? I said, yeah, we need to find out for sure what's going on, because we knew we weren't being told the truth by the media. There was no way. And I also had a lot of my constituents and then people throughout Idaho calling saying, what's happening over there? We want to go and support the Hammonds. And all of them, I said, wait, let's find out what really is going on, because I don't want you guys over there and have the feds come firebomb that refuge. Because I don't trust the feds at all. They don't have good sense. So we went there, and first of all, we went to talk to the sheriff and the county commissioners. The sheriff conveniently was absent and had a sheriff from Josephine County there. And there was only one county commissioner who is the head commissioner. And you know in Oregon they're called the judge. And the other two commissioners claimed they weren't even notified of the meeting. The district attorney was there. The commissioner's wife was there giving us dirty looks, and an FBI agent and an undersheriff. And the county commissioner was hostile from the first second we walked in there and attacked us for even being there, and then introduced his wife as, this is my wife, she works for the BLM. So that tells you everything right there.
Yeah, sure does.
It was incredible. We asked the sheriff, have they broken any laws? Those people at the refuge, have they broken any state laws? And the sheriff from Josephine County said absolutely not. He didn't even hesitate. So then we asked the FBI agent, have they broken any federal laws? And for a long time he wouldn't answer us, but after the third time, he finally said, well, that's being determined in Washington, D.C. So, I mean, that county commissioner kept yelling and screaming at us. It was incredible about how we had no business in his county. We needed to get out of there. If we went to the refuge, we were just as bad as the terrorists who were there. He used the word terrorists. Mm-hmm. So we decided we needed to get out of that courthouse. So we left, and we went in and talked for a while and decided the only way we're going to learn is to go to the refuge ourselves. By then it was night. We drove to the refuge. We met with Ammon and Lavoie, and numerous other people were there. I remember Shauna being there, but I don't know who the other people were at the big table. But Ammon, the minute you meet him, you're at ease. He's a typical rancher handshake. Look you right in the eye. Mm-hmm. Just a good person wanting to do the right thing. Seeing what they were doing to the Hammonds was what happened to his family and their neighbors and their ranches. So we talked with Ammon for a long time, and we tried to talk Ammon into moving to some private property and getting away from that refuge. But he was focused on staying there. And I was so worried what was going to happen to him. But instead, the feds decided to do what they were going to do elsewhere. And they had to stop Ammon because he was going all over talking about the Constitution. And he has a gift that is incredible. He can talk to people, put them at ease. He has incredible knowledge of the Constitution and all the laws. And he, as you know, was headed to John Day for one of those meetings. And then 2 days later, he was going to be in Jordan Valley to do the same thing. So the feds knew it, and they had to stop it because they had all those infiltrators in the refuge, embedded there, telling the feds exactly every step they were making. Such an outrage. So having
it is, and John Lamb, who is a gentleman who has been at all of the hearings of the Oregon and the Las Vegas trials, was trying to be on our show today. We need to. I need to find a time when we can get him on. We just, frankly, we run out of telephone lines because we can only have so many people on one program without running out of telephone lines. So I'm going to work out where I can get him on again. I had him on my Connecting the Dots show on RNN about 3 weeks ago, and I want to make sure that he's on, and I'd like to see if we can figure out a way. We've got to patch this together where we can have you folks on with him for some time, because he's been there, and one of the things that he talked about, and Hank, you've talked about this too, is the number of provocateurs, the number of federal agents that were in Bunkerville and that were in Burns, Oregon, and they were there to try to cause a lot of trouble. And, they weren't really effective, but they tried to be. Tell us what you think about the way that they tried to insert those folks.
So, you mean me? You're talking to me or Hank?
Well, I was talking to Hank, but I'm sure you can help, too. We'll get both of you on that one.
Anyhow, by the way, where they shot Lavoy Finicum, that was a planned murder. That's the only place between there and John Day of any distance that there are no cell phone signals, right by Idlewild Park. I know that for a fact. I grew up there. I happened to be in China when this thing unfolded. You could look right straight north and a little bit to the west of that headquarters, and that was my grandfather's ranch at the foot of Wright's Point. I will not defend the county judge. I grew up with him. I grew up with his wife. His wife's father was a very dear friend of mine. He ran the local radio station, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at the demographics of Burns, Oregon, if you want to talk about what's going on in the West, when Edward Hines Lumber Company had 1,000 employees, and Jippo loggers, and people logging and ranching, and all the things that have been eliminated by our federal government and the true eco-terrorists, the environmental groups, they've gutted that town. The only people left there are retirees that can't afford to move to Bend or some other fancy place, and BLM and Forest Service and government people. The biggest payday, the biggest employer in Harney County, half person per square mile, is the government. So Mr. County Judge Grasky, he's representing the people he represents, unfortunately, and that is the government. And that's what's happening all over the West, is these mills and agriculture's been shut down. They don't, the bureaucrats, there's no fewer of them. I mean, every time they eliminate an allotment or a rancher, they don't lay off anybody at the BLM. They don't lay off anybody anywhere. They don't even log hardly anymore. We burn our forest. ISIS and Al-Qaeda were thinking about setting our woods on fire. And then they realized, why should we? They let them burn anyhow. We've wasted natural resources. A timber patch or some grass on the federal lands or on private land is a renewable natural resource. You take care of it and it's there forever. And that's what we used to do. And now with this, the sky's falling chicken little, we've stopped that. And so now we have huge fires, huge fires. As they've eliminated grazing, fires have accelerated in the opposite direction. Same way with wildlife. As we've taken away the tools to limit predation, the number of prey base has vanished. All these things are a result, but not one biologist, not one person working for any government agency or any eco-terrorist group has lost their job. If I do something wrong and cannot pay my bills, and the bank tells me to bring my dolls and dishes to town, I'm done. These people, there's no consequences. That's number one problem.
No, exactly. And the thing is, they go out and they mine the big foundations for money. There's a payday for them no matter what, because they can convince all these Easterners and left coast residents that
the environment is being ruined by man, and therefore send us your money. And between the environmental groups and the foundations that support them, we're talking many billions of dollars. So naturally, they're going to be in it because it's in their self-interest to do so. The more radical they are, the more likely they're going to be able to get money. Judy, would you like to maybe finish up with your perspective of how these trials are going and what's happening in the West, and let our listeners know how they can help through Congress and through the legislature to make sure we turn this mess around?
Well, first of all, they've got to get to know their congressmen and their senators. That is vital. They are just regular people, and they represent you. So don't think that you can't talk to them, that they are untouchable. You have to directly talk to them. They're home, when they're not in D.C. and they're on recess, be at their office, wherever that is. Find out what their schedule is, make an appointment, and respectfully talk to them about these issues. It's vital you do that. And your state legislators, some of them are full-time, some of them aren't. You just have to figure that out and go talk to them. Tell them they took an oath to defend and protect the Constitution, and you believe that is their number one job. Talk to them about economics. Talk to them about your family. Call DOJ. Call the Attorney General's office in D.C. You can do that. And talk to them. This is what we expect. Call the White House. You want Hammond freed. This is such a miscarriage of justice. There are a lot of things citizens can do. They have incredible power. They just need to know it and use it. And I want to give a huge thank you to John Lamb. He was incredible. He was at that Portland courthouse all the time, every day, telling people what really was going on. And now he's doing the same in Las Vegas, taking time away from his family, his life, so that we can find out what really is happening. I'm extremely worried about Las Vegas juries, especially after that mass shooting. I know the Bundys requested that trial be moved to Reno, and of course the feds don't want that, so I don't know where that's going to finally shake down.
Well, I question whether the shooting in Las Vegas may have had further implications. So with that, I want to thank you folks for being our guest, and I will certainly ask that you come back sometime and we get a chance to talk more about many of these subjects. But you've been terrific guests, and I want to also remind our listeners to listen to Debbie Boscalupi's radio show at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. She'll have a 2-hour program, and she'll have a special guest. Patrick Wood will be her guest on that show. So please join her, and I thank all of you for tuning in, and come back next week and help us to connect the dots. Thank you again.
Rednecks lie.